What if the first named woman recorded after Eve carried a witness the world almost forgot? What if a single line in an ancient register held in shadow a theology of worth and a quiet protest against a lineage of violence? In Genesis, Lamech took 2 wives. One was named Adah. If you will, stay with me until the end of this reflection. Subscribe and press the little bell so these short meditations can find you when you need them. If this word meets you, leave a like and a comment. Tell us if you have ever felt overlooked. Now, listen. Adah lived in the long morning of the world, before the flood, when lines of kin were being traced and the first cities were being named. The map of that age was simple: tents on plains, the ringing sparks of a smith's hammer, the thin cry of a shepherd's eldest lamb. Names were not ornaments only, they were a way of staking a claim on memory. To be named in a register was to be granted a place in the telling of things. The list that includes Adah is brief, but the brevity itself sets a stage. A household's tension, and the small steady labor by which culture is formed. She is placed beside Zillah in the role of Lamech's wives. Lamech's voice, the record says, is bold and fierce. His household, in the telling, becomes a line where violence and boasts gather. Between that noise, Adah's presence is almost inaudible, yet precisely because of that slenderness, she becomes an emblem. She is, by name, an ornament, Adah, the one who is adorned. And that meaning moves like a thin thread through the narrative, a counterpoint to threat, a reminder that God's attention is not limited to the loudest voice. Life inside their tent would have been an assemblage of small textures. Dawn arrived as a cool gray, then cut slowly into gold. Adah rose not to proclamations, but to tasks, tending a small hearth, laying out skins to dry, weaving a strip of patterned cloth to bind a child's head against the sun. The smell of smoke braided with rendered fat, and the dry sweetness of crushed grain. She knotted cords with careful hands, showed a younger sister how to shape a reed into a pipe that would call goats at dusk, and hummed a tune that was perhaps a comfort, perhaps instruction. Her speech was the kind that shaped family memory. Short counsel, a soft reprimand, a story told at dusk so the children might see themselves as part of a long, enduring line. Jabal, named in the record as father of those who dwell in tents and have livestock, moved at her shoulder. He learned where an animal's limpness began, the patience of watching a flock, the geometry of herding across a distant ridge. Jubal, father of all who play the lyre and pipe, would pluck a crude instrument with fingers that had been taught to call, to soothe, to order time by melody. From the one household, work and song were being born together, craft and culture braided by the hands of domestic life. Tubal-Cain, the one later known for the forging of bronze and iron, carried into the world a skill with metal that would change the sound of campfires, the ring of hammer on anvil that set the rhythm for cities and for war alike. These sons, whether shaped more by Adah or Zillah, or the rough example of Lamech, became names for developments in human life, dwellings, music, metallurgy. The text is careful to place these names. It does not explain the tender, instructive hours that made men who would teach the world to build and to sing. That silence is the room where Adah's story waits. She did not speak in the register about the morals of the forge. The register records that Lamech took 2 wives, and it records his strange song of vengeance, the words that boast of retribution multiplied many times over. In a culture already gasping from Cain's crime, such a boast was a bitter echo. Lamech's voice, proud and blood-sated, is part of the genealogy's warning that violence begets more violence, that bravado becomes a seed with its own harvest. It is here, in the contrast, that Adah's meaning grows. The ornament, the one whose name suggests beauty and remembrance, stands opposite the sword and the boast. Imagine for a moment one evening by the tent. The sky had the heavy hush of summer. Even the wind seemed subdued. Lamech speaks aloud at the gate or by the hearth, his words rough and loud, rolling over the earthen floor. He will call attention to grievances and answer them with a song. It is public, performative. Nearby, Adah sits, her hands moving a spindle, her eyes on the flame. The children listen to both. The furious music of words that promise revenge, the steadier pulse of a mother's hum that counts the tasks and names the days. Zillah watches too, similar in name, similar in place, perhaps colder in manner, or perhaps simply different. The text allows no easy portrait of rivalry or concord, only the fact of two women in one man's household. Out of that household come two strains that will mark human culture. From the one line comes tents and flocks, people who would learn to dwell and to steward. From another, pipes and lyres, music that orders grief, that remembers, that praises. From a third hand comes the hammer's ring, a craft that will bend the world into tools and weapons. These parallel gifts are not morally neutral. They can be used to build or to wound. The same lyre that calls a bride to her home can accompany a lament over a slain friend. A forge that makes a plow may also make a blade. It is here, in the moral ambivalence of gifts, that the narrative draws a knife edge. Human creativity bears the imprint of divine image and yet is never immune to corruption. Do not miss the theological gravity here. The text names Adah and thereby allows us to say that God's memory works differently from ours. When men boast, they seek to inscribe themselves into story with bruit and claim. God, however, writes names in a ledger that honors tenderness, the unseen craft, the quiet teaching at a child's elbow. Adah is named, and by being named, she becomes a place where the reader can stand and see a different kind of legacy, that which endures because it is tender, not because it excels in power. That is a provocative claim for a world that often rewards the shout more than the song. There is a subtle theology of remembrance at play. Scripture often surveys lineages not simply to flatter pedigree, but to show what kinds of life God notices. Names are selected, and in that selection a theology speaks. Adah's appearance is brief, but the brevity does not betray insignificance. It argues the opposite, that to be remembered at all in a register carved by men is to stand against oblivion. For those who feel unseen in their corners, women who have labored in kitchens and tents, the unseen teachers of songs and manners, Adah's name can be read as a pledge. God remembers the ornament, the one who adorns life with patience and craft. There is also a pastoral warning threaded through the story. Lamech's boast is not only a personal failing, it signals cultural sickness. When a household crowns vengeance with poetry, when retribution is elevated to song, the capacity for violence feeds itself. The genealogy links Cain's first sin to a widening circle of harm. Against that, the quiet culture of Adah's household becomes an act of resistance. Her weaving, her teaching of pipes, her naming of days form habits that refuse the logic of escalation. To stitch a garment and to teach a son to play a reed is to rehearse peace in small measures when the world rehearses war in large ones. Listen now as a pastoral question. Have you ever felt that your small labors do not count, that your quiet work disappears beneath the roar of louder claims? If so, hear this as balm. God names the quiet. The world may measure worth by visibility and force, but the God who remembers creates a different metric. The hand that stitches and the voice that teaches count in his ledger. You are not invisible to the one who counts names. Yet this is not a sentimental escape. The narrative of Genesis is unsparing. Gifts are double-edged, and human choice matters. Tubal-Cain's forge will produce both plowshare and sword. Jubal's music will accompany both harvest and lament. Jabal's tents will house both family and the ambitions of a people. Naming Adah does not erase the moral calculus, it illuminates it. We are called to take our craft and form in directions that honor life, not amplify harm. The ornament must not be weaponized. The song must not be turned into a marching chant for vengeance. That is the challenge threaded through the genealogy. Adah's dignity also suggests a countercultural glimpse of femininity in the early world. While the text gives no long monologue for her, it places a woman whose name means adornment at a critical hinge. Culture springs in both beauty and brutality. Nurture and craft sit beside the forge. To read Adah as a mere background figure is to miss that the chronicler, by choosing to write her name, has given the reader a point of resistance. She is a sign that God notices what human historians might neglect: the formative power of womanly endurance, the domestic arts that frame civil life, the moral formation that happens in simple habits. Consider as well the typological path that can be traced from such an image. It is not to claim that Adah is the bride of later revelation. That would step beyond what the text allows. But typologically, the motif of the adorned woman recurs in Scripture: a bride who is loved, a people who are adorned by grace. If we read Adah with care, we can see a foreshadowing. In a lineage tarnished by violence, a woman named for beauty stands as a foretaste of a better remembering: the bride who is cherished, the city adorned by God. Call this a reading with restraint, an interpretation that places Adah within a long theological arc without asserting historical identity beyond what is written. There are moments in the life of any household when the clash between worldliness and grace becomes audible. Imagine a day when Tubal-Cain strikes a new shape on his anvil and sees in the glint not only the pride of craft, but also the potential for destruction. Imagine Jubal plucking a note that could hold a bride's step or the dirge for a fallen neighbor. Imagine Jabal bringing home news of a settled boundary and hearing under it all the hush of Adah's counsel. These are the scenes the text allows us to imagine, not as scripture, but as plausible interior life that gives moral weight to the names we have. And here is the pastoral thrust. If you are forming a child, a craft, a song, a habit that will outlast you, then you are shaping the world. The generations do not only inherit tools, they inherit practices of heart. Adah's household teaches that the smallest acts, teaching a child to hum instead of curse, binding a wound instead of sharpening a knife, belong to the economy of remembrance. God names such acts, and in that naming there is dignity. Before we move further into how these small acts resist the logic of pride, let us hold the image of Adah at the hearth. Her hands stained with dye, the pipe resting on her knee, the child asleep with a lyre beside him. It is a quiet, ordinary scene, but it refuses the noisier claim of Lamech that a measure of a man is his capacity to avenge. In that refusal there is a prophetic witness, not loud but persistent. The world will remember Lamech's boast, and it remembers the cost of boasting. But Scripture also allows us to remember Adah's steadiness. How then do we live in light of this memory? How do we become keepers of the kind of culture Adah embodies? We will return to that and to the ways music and metal can be reclaimed for life rather than used for domination. For now, carry this: you are not invisible. Names matter to God. What you carefully embroider into small lives will one day show up as tents that shelter, songs that heal, and tools that cultivate rather than destroy. Adah's place in the brief register of Genesis is a summons to take the understated and make it sacred. There is then a practical hermeneutic embedded in the register of names. To read the genealogy well is to learn how culture gets made. Names are not neutral labels. They are hinges that open into habit. If Adah means ornament, then her presence in the list is an invitation to ask how ornaments are made and how they teach. Ornaments are small: a dyed hem, a braided cord, a song taught to hush a child. Yet small things teach the measure of a people. They teach what is held dear, what is to be preserved, what is to be handed on when hands no longer work the loom. What follows from this is not a sentimental call to domesticity as an end in itself, but a summons to intentional formation. The maker of metal is a moral actor. The singer is a formation agent. The tent builder and the tent dweller together create the grammar of belonging. When Tubal-Cain raises the hammer, he does not only shape iron, he shapes expectations. When Jubal plucks a strained string, he does not only make noise, he affirms what the ear will come to expect as beauty or as terror. The choice is practical and communal. To live in light of that is to recognize three related practices that ancient households could and did undertake. Practices still legible for any community that seeks to resist the logic of boastful violence. First, naming and narrative. The household that names remembers. A name spoken at table, a story told by the fire, a lament rehearsed on the lyre. These are repositories of memory. They teach what grief is and what hope is. They teach restraint by retelling consequences. The family that tells of a foolish ancestor who took vengeance and ruined his sons will, over time, teach children caution before pride. The counter-memory is not simply the erasure of violence, it is the cultivation of a different allegiance, an allegiance to life, to mending, to repair. In ancient terms, this happens in the same way altars and stones marked a people's passage. Speech and song create standing stones in the mind. Second, ritualization of ordinary work. The anvil can be consecrated by routine. Before the first blade is cooled, a maker might stop, wet his hand, and mutter a short blessing. An ordinary consecration, nothing elaborate, a recognition that the tool is for the land, not for indiscriminate striking. A woman who twists dyed thread into a band might sing the names of those she intends to protect. Work, when done with an orientation beyond self-aggrandizement, becomes pedagogy. It teaches a child to bend toward service rather than spectacle. The loom, the plow, the lyre, these are means by which virtue is taught or undone. Third, practices of care. A culture forms in how it treats wounds, guests, the aged, and the stranger. The seam that binds a garment, the broth offered to a wayfarer, the hand used to bind a wound. These small acts are public theology. They declare what a people consider holy. Lamech's boast insists that honor is defended by force. Adah's life, as the text suggests, insists that honor is established by fidelity and repair. To choose the latter is to make a different kind of polity, one where rescue rather than retaliation becomes the default. None of this undermines the reality of conflict. The world of Genesis is a world of scarcity, of sharp edges, of hunger and fear. The reclaiming we speak of is not naive pacifism that ignores wolf and famine. It is rather a shrewd redirection of resources, to invest in plowshares when swords would be easier to display, to teach a child a healing song before teaching him a war chant, to make the household the first school of the soul. In that economy, strength is reimagined. Strength becomes endurance, capacity to hold when wounds do not close, generosity when hoarding would be simpler. There is also a theological grammar at work. Ordinary things can be sacramental. The chronicler who names Adah gives the reader a hint that God notices the small. Scripture elsewhere remembers how God meets people in ordinary bread and in a stranger at the roadside. To name the ordinary is to give it ontological weight. The spoon, the spindle, the song acquire moral freight. When the people of God treat work and song as offerings, they sanctify time itself. Sabbath language, altars, memorial stones, these are the ways the ancient community set aside the ordinary as locus of covenantal memory. In small things, the heart is taught where to look. One difficulty in this pastoral is that ornaments and instruments are ambivalent. They can adorn or arm us, uplift or coerce. This moral ambivalence is not new to Genesis. It is explicit in the contrast between Jubal's music, which can comfort, and the very same music's potential to lead crowds into bloodlust when a ruler bends art to drum up hatred. The chronicler gives us both possibility and warning. Thus, the ethical task is not to abolish instruments, but to educate their uses, to teach a community how to listen, and to teach a craftsman how to orient his instruments. Skill toward cultivation rather than domination. How might that education proceed in the life described by the register? Consider a small set of practices that are faithful to the world evoked by the text and defensible in an ancient setting. Household instruction. The parent who weaves or hammers works in sight of the child. The child learns not in abstraction, but in apprenticeship. How a tool is cared for, how a song is tuned, how a gate respects the 10th threshold. The pedagogy is embodied. Stories of past deeds, both noble and foolish, are told at the hearth, with commentary. See how this ended, so you will not be proud. The moral lesson is not a lecture, but a tale embedded in smell, rhythm, and repetition. Communal witness. Elders and women of the tent function as public memory. They name wrongdoings and their costs, and at the same time practice forgiveness and repair. The community sets norms by example, how they bury their dead, how they feed widows, how they respond when a craftsman is tempted to sell arms to brigands. Public practices such as letting harvests stand for gleaners, bringing the first fruit to an altar, or making a song that recounts mercy. These are public pedagogies that shape the common soul. Liturgical reorientation. Songs of lament and gratitude are taught as part of the workday. A plowman hums a refrain that names dependence. A woman binding a wound sings a blessing that names the healer. Music so integrated becomes a moral language. In grief it gives shape to tears. In labor it communicates interdependence. The lyre becomes, in practice, a teacher of humility. Accountability rituals. Where Lamech's words find echo, a people must have counterspeech. The elder's seat at the gate, the calling together of kin, the public admission of wrong. These are mechanisms that check private vengeance and redirect anger into restitution. Such practices are not juridical inventions of anachronistic courts, but the old biblical ways a tribe policed itself, through shame, apology, and reparative acts that restore relational balance. All of these move toward a single horizon, the inscription of life into habit. God's memory and human memory intersect where names are spoken and deeds are repeated. Adah's unassuming place in the register thus becomes a paradigm. Modest, steady acts, over time, reconstitute the moral contours of a people. Let us picture for a moment a dusk scene. The sun drops behind a low ridge. Smoke threads from the hearth. Tubal-Cain sets his hammer aside and lays a cooled share of iron against the tent's outer peg. He looks at it not with triumph, but with a question. Does this tool feed, or does it affront? Inside, Adah mends a hem, blue dye staining the tip of her thumb. She hums a short melody that echoes the cadence of the fields. Jubal sits close by, fingers moving the strings as if testing the world's temper. A child, sleepy and soot-marked, tries to repeat the tune and garbles the line.
Adah laughs softly. Lamech's boast is not unseen. It is spoken in other places, banners raised, a voice that thinks honor must be measured in blood. But in this tent, the simpler grammar holds sway. The measure of a person is not how many blow the anvil can drive, but how many mouths are fed, how many hurts are tended, how many lullabies outlast a season of storm. From such a scene, we can extract an ethic for leadership and for ordinary life. Leaders, whether those who lead in war, in craft, or in song, must be assessed by what their leadership produces over time. Does it enlarge the common table or shrink it? Does it teach children to bind wounds or to count heads for tally? The chronicler's placement of names is itself a judgment. Those who are remembered for what they bequeath, habits of life or patterns of ruin. Typology helps here without lapsing into fossil allegory. The motif of the adorned woman reappears in Scripture as an image of a people beloved, a city made fair. That recurrence is not a proof text to be forced into a single figure. It is a pattern that invites the reader to see how the small beautifications of daily life foreshadow greater forms of redemption. When a people trains its artisans, cares for its children, sings its laments and hymns, it is not merely preserving culture. It is preparing a people capable of receiving a fuller promise, a people who know how to be beloved because they have learned to love rightly. This formation is neither automatic nor assured. The same hands that sew can stitch bonds of enmity. The same strings that soothe can be cottoned into cords of manipulation. Hence the persistent need for the prophetic countervoice. Scripture is full of calls to return, calls that are sometimes loud and sometimes only audible where a woman hums by the hearth. That hum can be prophetic, a small, steady witness that insists on another standard. The chronicler's quiet gesture, writing Adah's name, puts that hum into the text and into the memory of those who read. What then of the instruments most liable to be bent toward violence? The metal and the song. How do we reclaim them? Reclamation begins by refusing the myth that craft is morally neutral in practice. A craftsman does not labor in a vacuum. His hammer, his measure, his market, these are embedded in relationships. To reclaim the metal is to reorient markets, to teach apprentices not only technique but telos. What is the purpose of a plow? To feed. What is the purpose of an axe? To clear brambles, not to exile a neighbor. To reclaim music is to teach ears the difference between a refrain that invites and a refrain that incites. It is to rehearse lament as well as triumph. There are, therefore, disciplines a community can take up, apprenticeship that pairs skill with a story of use, liturgies that bless tools and songs before they enter the public square, communal sanctions for those who fragment art into propaganda for violence. These are not inventions of a modern ethic. They are continuations of ancient wisdom, ways a people keeps its soul. At the center remains a theological claim that the chronicler makes without preaching it outright. God counts the small faithfulnesses. A name is carved into the list not because it dazzles, but because it testifies. To carry that testimony in our own making, be it thread, steel, or song, is to participate in the salvage of creation. The task is not heroic in the narrow sense. It is patient, repetitive, mundane. It asks for hands stained with dye and faces tired from work. Hands that will teach their children, hands that will bind the neighbor's wound, hands that will refuse to sharpen a blade for boastful triumph. So keep the image in mind. Adah at the hearth, the child with the lyre. Tubal-Cain laying down a share that will till rather than tear. Let that quiet scene be the standard against which loud claims of greatness are judged. In the small, the future is made. In the small, the possibility of a people who are adorned by grace rather than scarred by pride is kept alive. There remain particular ways to translate such reflection into practice among families and gatherings that live in tents and fields. We will trace those practices more concretely, how songs are taught, how tools are blessed, how disputes are turned into restoration, showing by example how a household might shift from an economy of honor through violence to an economy of honor through service and repair. For now, hold fast to this. Names matter. Habits last. The small acts of life are the real instruments of legacy.
If you would be a maker of culture, begin with the smallest thing you can touch: the hem, the tune, the hand that binds a wound. There the world is formed anew. Begin then with the forge and the loom. The apprenticeship of a plowshare need not begin with lectures on right and wrong. It begins with a story. The mastersmith takes the novice to the place where the village keeps its old implements and points out a blade nicked in 100 places. He sets the blade on the anvil and tells of the man who used it, how he rose before dawn to turn the stubborn furrow, how he brought his grain when famine came, how he refused once to temper a spear for a neighbor who sought glory in another's field. The tale is short and concrete. It names faces, seasons, failures, and acts of mercy. The apprentice watches the metal glow under the hammer, and hears, muted beneath the ringing, the claim made by use. This is for feeding. This is for mending. This is for service. Skill without story is a dangerous treasure. Skill with story makes a covenant. So the first discipline is story-woven apprenticeship. Each lesson begins with a memory. Each tool is given an account of its first good employment. The teacher speaks not of abstract virtue, but of an instance in which a tool repaired life. The young weaver learns a pattern, while the elder tells of the cloak that saved a child from fever because its maker had mixed an herb into the dye. The harper learns a melody beside the hearth and is told of the night when that melody quieted a household on the edge of vengeance. These short accounts do a slow moral work. They root technique in telos, and they make the ordinary heroic by giving it a narrative. Second, make liturgical gestures of blessing ordinary things. Before tools are placed for use, they are named and blessed in the presence of witnesses. A smith, before the first heat of a new season, carries his hammer to the door of the house where the elders sit. There the elders lay their hands upon it or simply speak a word. May this hammer strike only for repair. May the spark that flies from it not be the beginning of a fire that consumes a neighbor. The oil that anoints a plowshare is not magic, but vow. It is a sign that the community has seen the instrument and bound its maker to account. Such rites are small, 2 words, a touch of oil, a sharing of bread, but they make private labor public and so curb the private use of violence. Third, teach music as formation, not merely as entertainment. Songs are taught in families as catechesis. A mother does not merely hum a tune to send a child to sleep, she shapes vocabulary into refrain. Her lullaby names weakness and dependence, the need for mercy, the hope of repair. At the next harvest, a chorus of children takes that lullaby and turns it into a work song that keeps time with the scythe and translates mercy into rhythm. Music must be rehearsed both for lament and for praise. A people that only sings triumph will be slow to hear its wounds. The refrains that invite are learned alongside refrains that mourn. Both form ears that can distinguish a call to courage from a call to hatred. Fourth, restore dispute through public mending rather than secret vengeance. When theft, insult, or injury breaks the social fabric, the first measure is restitution made visible. The offender does not vanish into exile, but comes to the assembly with the broken thing in their hands or with the account of harm they have done. They present what they will return. They show the labor they will undertake to repair what was rent. The community names representatives to witness the repair. Those representatives testify when the work is done. In some villages, the rite includes a shared meal, at which both parties eat the same bread for the first time since the breach, an action that binds stomach to stomach and makes reconciliation less abstract. Justice here is restorative, not merely punitive. It seeks to remake what was
torn. Fifth, bind apprenticeship to fellowship. A young man apprenticed to a smith must, in time, sit at table with the smith's neighbors and hear their judgments on the use of the smith's work. If the smith's wares have been turned into weapons, the neighbors call for correction. If the smith refuses, the community may withdraw its orders until the smith redeems his craft by a season of making plowshares at no cost for those in need.
These social sanctions are calibrated to restore honor through repair rather than to humiliate. They presuppose a society where honor is held communally and where reputation can be mended by service. Sixth, cultivate small sacramentals at the household level. Before a bride takes a needle into her hand, she receives from her mother a scrap of cloth sewn with a single durable stitch, a reminder that the first stitch holds more than fabric. The father gives the youth going to the field a short prayer to say over the hands each morning, a brief petition that they be strong for work and gentle in use. These acts are not legalisms, they are ways of habituating conscience. The daily repetition of a short embodied text reshapes desire. Hands learn to slow because they have been told each morning what they are for. Finally, keep the prophetic voice present in the ordinary. The prophetic countervoice need not always thunder from the square. Sometimes it is the seamstress who refuses a commission to embroider a banner of conquest. Sometimes it is the lad who refuses to join a raid because his mother taught him a different refrain at the hearth. The community honors such refusals not as eccentricities, but as signs of fidelity. The elders, too, must listen. When a small voice hums against the current, the elders are obliged to give that voice a seat at the door. These practices, story-woven apprenticeship, brief rites of blessing, music that trains ears for lament, public mending of breaches, fellowship-bound sanctions, household sacramentals, and the continual attention to prophetic murmurs, compose a regimen for a people that wishes to make culture without making instruments of destruction. They are small because they must be small. Only what is taken up in the hands and heard by the children can become habit. If you wish to test their efficacy, study a village where they are practiced. You will find fewer men who measure honor by the breadth of their scars, fewer households where songs end in the name of the enemy. To return again to the hem, teach the hem as both craft and covenant. Let the child who learns to stitch first be tasked with mending a neighbor's cloak. Let the one who strings the lyre be asked to play for a house of mourning before he plays for a house of festivity. Let the smith produce, for a season, more plowshares than blades. These are not grand programs. They are ways to make virtue the texture of life. So begin.
Where the world can be taken in hand. Bind a name into the chronicle. Bless a plow. Teach a lament beside the cradle. Settle disputes at the firelight with witnesses and bread. In the repetition of these small acts, a people learns to be beloved. They learn, slowly, to translate honor into service. The future, as the chronicler implies by the simple gesture of writing a name, is made of such stitches. And so we return to the hearth, to Adah's hum, to the apprentice who lifts his hammer and hears in the ringing the long voice of a people calling him to make rather than to mar. Adah's hum rose and fell like the breath of the house. The needle passed through the faded wool with a comfort born of years. The stitch made, the stitch pulled tight, the thread trimmed and tucked. Beside her, the apprentice, Eli, sat with his hands still smelling of coal and oil, his palms marked where the hammer kissed metal. He watched the seam tighten, as if he could learn a new patience by watching it happen. "The hem remembers the hand," Adah said without looking up. Her voice was small and steady, as if she were reciting a line of prayer. "We do this so the cloak does not shout when you walk. We do this so the rips come less often." Eli folded the mended cloak on his knees. The fabric looked lighter than it had the week before, as if a weight had been taken off it. Outside, in the yard, the smith's bell rang once, twice, the summons that meant the smith would be at his forge until the sun sat low. That bell had been rung for weddings and plough-making, for the forging of irons in the market, and for the tempering of horseshoes. It was a voice that measured the hours. He carried the cloak to the doorstep, where the owner, an old woman named Miriam, waited. Her eyes were rimmed with the red of someone who had slept poorly. She took the cloak and lifted it, as if feeling for new seams, then let her hand fall at Eli's sleeve. "Thank you," she said.
She offered him a strip of flatbread braided with sesame. It had been warmed on a hot stone and still gave off steam. He ate without thinking. The bread filled his hunger and quieted something inside him. On the way back to the forge, he passed through the narrow lane, where a group had gathered at a doorway. Voices rose and fell. A youth had accused a neighbor of sharpening a blade for a band that had passed through months before, men who traded in stolen cattle and shouted long into the night. The smith in question, Tov, stood with his arms folded. He was a broad man, whose cheeks had been softened by years of laughter, and who had been an apprentice once himself. The elders had come to the door. They spoke in measured
phrases that the lanes would repeat later, like a chorus. We must know what the smith makes and why. If a blade is used to wound unjustly, we will call for repair. If the smith will not make reparation, then he must make plowshares for those who till the furrows. Eli slowed. He had sat at this very door before and heard such judgments read out like the beating of a drum. He had seen men put their hands into the palms of their fellows and vow to live differently. He had watched craftsmen lift their faces and bend their backs to service until honor returned to them, not because they had been humiliated, but because they had offered to mend what had been marred. Inside the smithy, the heat hugged him. The bellows breathed. The hammer sang against the anvil, a voice that had not forgotten the melody of the world. The smith, Adah, nodded at Eli and passed him the tongs. There were no words needed. The rhythm of work was instruction enough. Eli raised the hammer, felt the familiar thunk, and the metal yielded, not under force alone, but under the measured eye of someone who taught him to look and to listen. You will shape it this season like a plow, Adah said between strokes, not only because the elders have asked, but because there is a rightness to it. Hands that make must sometimes choose what they will make. Eli's wrist stung. He thought of the coin that the traveling man had slipped into his palm not a fortnight ago. Not much, but enough to make him imagine a different kind of measure of worth. He imagined blades bearing his maker's mark away from the lanes and into other hands. He imagined laughter at the market where he would be praised. The thought tasted like ash. Remember the test, Adah had told him the first day. If you make for the taking of lands, you are not only shaping metal, you are shaping the sound a child will hear when the wind carries the shout of a wound. He breathed and let the hammer fall again. The red metal opened under his strike, and he coaxed it with the tongs to the form of a share. He thought of the earth beside the furrow, how it lay patient under the wheel, how it received the blade, not as an end, but as a beginning. The metal cooled in the quench with a hiss like a small rain. When he raised it, it was dull and honest, ready to turn soil instead of flesh. Days stitched together like the hems Adah taught. Eli was asked, as apprenticeship demanded, to do small acts that bound him to the village's life. He mended a neighbor's cloak without being told. He tuned a lyre for the man who sang at funerals before he played at weddings. Once, when a dispute arose between two sisters over a herds division, he hammered stakes and set them to rights until the women laughed at the awkwardness of their anger and ate together from the same bowl, a repair held in the heat of his palms. The prophetic voice, often a seamstress refusing a grotesque commission, sometimes a child's no that stopped a raid, found its way into his days. He learned that fidelity was not an orator's cry, but the quiet refusal to let skill be used for harm. He watched Tov, the smith accused before, come to terms with his mistake when witnesses spoke of the men who had used his blades. Tov did not deny. He made public reparation, a season where he would repair all the plows in the community at no charge, where he would teach his apprentices to temper for tilling rather than for killing. People came with dull shares and worn blades, and left with tools less likely to cause grief.
On an evening when the moon slivered thin, the village gathered by the communal fire for a mending rite. Two young men who had engaged in a feud the month prior sat across from each other. Each had torn the other's coat in a fit of passion. Each had blamed the other for the blow that had ended with curses shouted and doors shut. Under the low light, with witnesses present, neighbors, mothers, the smith, and the seamstress, each repaired a scrap from the other's cloak. They spoke short words. "I will stitch. I will mend. I am sorry." The elder at the door called them by name and commanded a shared bread be broken. They ate from the same loaf for the first time since their breach. The action was small and precise. The bread warmed their mouths and cooled the heat of their anger. Eli watched and felt the stitches of the society tighten around him like a garment being finished. He understood that his hammer's ring was part of a larger music, that his choices would be measured not only by his own stomach's needs, but by the man to his left and the child whose cradle thrummed in the night. To make was to answer was to be accountable. Word arrived then of a caravan that would pass the ridge with a load heavy in copper and fine cloth. Caravans were always a test. They brought gifts and gossip, songs and new tools. They also brought the danger of appetite. At the door, a woman from the ridge came to ask. One of the travelers sought a sword tempered in a particular heat, a beauty meant for an officer who liked his weapons to shine like a promise. The woman's husband had been taken in one such promise 5 years earlier. His name was still breathed at the threshold on nights when the rain came. The elders convened in the shade of the elder tree, where men and women listened as if the branches themselves were judges. They did not speak in thunder. They spoke in, "We will allow the smith to offer work, but we ask for witness. We will ask the smith to name the buyer and pledge where the blade will go." Tov, who had made the plowshares, inclined his head and promised to heed the counsel. Adah looked toward Eli as if asking him what he would do. Eli's answer was not rhetorical. He stepped forward and said simply, "I will temper differently. If the smith wishes, I will pour my hand to the plows this season. I will not make the sword for a man whose cause we do not know." It was a small refusal, and also a small courage. The caravan came and unrolled its wares in the square. Among them was indeed the officer's sword, bright and asking for an edge. Tov's hands were steady. He took coin and thought of the orders that shaped a man's life. At the threshold, he remembered the look of Miriam when she first brought her cloak for mending, how the act of repair had softened her face. He thought of the boy who had refused a raid long ago because his mother had given him a song to sing instead of a spear. Tov did not take the commission. The officer left pleased, but empty of Tov's mark. For the smith there was shame the first day, and a lighter conscience the second. He went back to making plowshares, and in return the community bought his work at the market and praised him for mending what had been marred. Eli's hammer continued to ring. Sometimes it struck a blade and the ring sounded hollow, an echo of a choice deferred. More often now it struck a share, and the ring was deep as the soil. The apprentices who watched him learned that making could be a sermon. They learned that economy and ethics could walk the same road if the village would hold them to it. One morning, while he cooled a piece of iron, Adah came to the forge and leaned against the open door. She smelled of baking and thread. She held in her hands a small scrap of cloth, a square stitched with a single durable stitch. "For the one who mends without show," she said. She pressed the cloth into his palm. "When you go out there," she smiled, "you must carry this, to remind you of the first stitch." Eli looked at the scrap and then at the horizon where the light lay soft over the fields. He tucked the cloth into his tunic above his heart. The day rode on steady. That evening the village bell rang once more, not for summons, but for supper. Families gathered and ate. Songs that trained ears for lament and joy were sung in turns. The lyre that Eli had tuned earlier was taken up and played, its strings coaxed toward a song that both honored what had been,
lost, and called the living to better keeping. In the quiet after the meal, when only a few embers glowed and the night's breath cooled the forge, Eli sat at the threshold and read the pattern Adah had taught him: stitch, hammer, song. He saw, not in a plan or in a law, but in daily labor, the shape of a life that would not be bent toward war. He understood that the long voice he had heard when his hammer rang was not an abstract command, but the chorus of his people calling him to choose. Somewhere beyond the ridge, a traveler muttered of other kingdoms where honor was counted by scars. Eli could imagine those places, but could also imagine his neighbor's face, the seam stitched into Miriam's cloak, the bread eaten across a table the color of smoke and light. He rose and stepped back into the smithy. The hammer had already cooled, but tomorrow the bell would ring and the work would begin again. He would answer with a hand taught by Adah, tempered by the elders, shaped in the public square. Outside, the night wind moved through the village like a slow liturgy, and the bell's echoes lay over the roofs like an after-song. Within the steady loop of stitch and strike, of witness and bread, a people kept remaking themselves. The rhythm was not sudden nor spectacular. It was slow. It was stubborn. It was enough to make men and women choose to make rather than to mar. And so Eli set another piece of iron upon the anvil, raised the hammer, and listened for the voice, old and patient, that had guided his hand since the first day he had come to keep the world whole. He struck, the metal sang, the village listened.